the American empire coming out of World War II, is in the late stages of its collapse, and it's very likely that either our version or the machinic, the AI version that will come after that, is the last possible move in the game A metagame. Unless you can have certainty that a digital agent that you're interacting with is a human, you will be encountering something that is vastly more capable than you are. This is the key piece. At a certain point in time, no human being is going to be able to penetrate the thicket of these wildly sophisticated AIs.
Jordan Hall, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yes, very nice. I look forward to the conversation.
I found a short video of you on the internet explaining how at 5 years old, you had kind of an existential awareness of something going profoundly wrong in our culture by watching a commercial for a Happy Meal.
Yes,
that's right?
That's right, actually.
Yeah, I thought it could be a nice place to start. Can you share a bit about this story?
Yeah, I mean, it's in some sense, I imagine, very, how do you say, very simple, and very many people have probably had something like this experience. But it was existential. It shook me. It shook me up enough that I still remember it quite sharply, which was, when I was in a naive state, the ordinary naive state of a child, which is that I trusted that the things that my culture were telling me were trustworthy, were worthy of trust. Again, naively, just assuming. And so, of course, I watched on this box, on this TV. It was in my living room, right, like a grandparent. And it was telling me that there was this wonderful thing, this artifact called a Happy Meal that existed in this wonderful place called McDonald's. And so I convinced my parents. I'm sure that I whined incessantly until we got a chance to get a Happy Meal. And then I experienced the real thing. And what I noticed was that it wasn't happy. It was a meal-ish, right? It was okay. But the context of what I had been led to believe, and let's say at the emotional level, like a sense of beauty and goodness, was notably absent. And what I remember is just feeling the realization of, how do I say it right? Like when I expressed that this seemed, there was an abrupt wrongness to it. Also the fact that the adults in my environment were unimpressed by that reality. In other words, they had tacitly already accepted that our culture lies to us routinely as just being the state of affairs. And this is a double, right? One was, hey, my culture lies to me. And also the adults in my culture are reasonably uninterested in that reality, as opposed to being shocked and outraged by it, as one would expect, I think. And so the shift was one of like a removal, like one step back of naive, like a step of, what do they call it? A stance of skepticism, like a stance of, everything from that point forward, literally was like, what exactly is happening here, and how trustworthy is this thing that I'm interacting with? Yeah, so that's that story.
And a couple years later, you are one of the main personalities behind the concept of Game B. I think it might be useful first to define what is Game A, what are some of its main characteristics, and it could be interesting that you shared the story of Game B, and how did you work with other personalities on this framing?
Okay, so we get to, let's say, 2008, which was a couple of years later, and I happen to be in a situation where I'm spending a lot of time with the kind of the global cultural elite, business leaders, political leaders, scientific leaders, etc. When the financial crisis of 2008 starts to happen. And so what I get to see is that the official story through official channels in the United States, this would be something like, say, MSNBC. And then the story that is heard inside the the elite structures who know better, right? They know what's really going on, are not the same story. They're completely unrelated, actually. And then the second thing that I noticed is that the people who let's say in some sense should know what's going on, or at least be able to respond to it from a place of maturity, didn't know what was going on and didn't have a strong way of responding to it. And so this just led me to be a little alarmed and quite curious. And so I began pulling on the thread. And this led me to investigating all sorts of things like, okay, what is the nature of money? And discovering that our economic institutions don't really have a good answer to that question. Well, I would say they actually have a poor answer to that question. That's a better way of putting it. It's not that they don't have an answer; they have a poor answer, which they then just use. But then also, what's the relationship between money and culture, or between power and technology? Like, all these different things began to spiral out, and I dig deeper and deeper. At a certain point, probably now by about 2011, 2012, what I begin to notice is a dawning sense that something is deeply awry, that the financial crisis was not just a one-off event, but was tied into a deeper fabric. And that deeper fabric, which now I would say is, say, our civilization, or perhaps civilization itself. So that's two levels of abstraction, our civilization and civilization itself, is undergoing a profound systematic collapse event. So that's the dawning realization. Well, so the next hypothesis, or maybe response, is if that's true. So one, is that true? And then if that's true, how might we respond to that? That's a very large thing, something you may want to take seriously if you care about kind of anything. So this begins the process that then formulates game A and then ultimately game B. So in order to make sense of the question of what's happening, is civilization collapsing, you have to do things like think about, well, what is civilization? And are there ways of understanding how it operates? Is it systematic? Can we think about it properly? Can we build a theory of civilization? And if we can we use that to diagnose the events that we're watching? And do they happen in a way that we can begin to make more and more sense of? So in this process, I began to meet a number of people, many of whom have become substantially more known. People like Eric and Brett Weinstein, Jim Rutt, who you may have seen me on one of his podcasts. These are people who were very central to this conversation. Because we were all more or less asking the same set of questions. And as we began to notice each other, we began asking those questions with each other. We had ended up producing Peter Turchin, if you've read his books. He was also part of those conversations.
Yeah, actually, I'll interview Peter next month.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'll say hi.
Yeah, sure.
His work on cleodynamics was directly adjacent, and he and I had several conversations on that front, trying to think about this exact kind of question. And the answer, broadly speaking, is yes. You can form something like a science of history, and you can form something like a science of civilization. And these sciences indicate that our civilization is nearing the end of its cycle, of its secular cycle. And then I make the stronger claim, which then leads us to game A, that in fact we are likely at the end of a metacycle of civilization itself, meaning that the category of civilization, which now I'll just call game A. So in some sense, you can say civilization and game A mean more or less the same thing. But I could be more formal with game A because it's my own idea, so I could just define it. So that there's a set of characteristics that largely result in the context of a pre-civilization set of conflict dynamics between what I call the indigenous mode. So the anthropological state of humans, that is where Homo sapiens emerges, bands of humans, kin-related, all innovating and speaking the same language, all with the same cultural background, all within a relatively small number of people, called Dunbar 3 to Dunbar 4 size. Some relatively sedentary because the niche they're in supports that, some relatively nomadic because their niche they're in supports that, but more or less running what I would call the same toolkit. And when that's happening, that itself, human indigenous mode, becomes a kind of niche. If a group of humans can invent a new socio-technical architecture that allows them to do roughly two things. One is to scale the number of people that are connected to the same sociological environment. So indigenous mode can't add many more people. As the clan grows, as the family grows, it fragments into smaller groups, and those smaller groups have a relationship to each other. And they may gather together periodically to maintain that relationship, but they're definitely the center of activity, and the center of the ability to coordinate is in the local band. So, once it gets past 150 people, a different kind of thing has to happen. So if you can build a social technology that allows you to add more people, let's say thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, and it has to be able to do so in a fashion which integrates an arbitrarily large number of different kin groups. So it has to be able to take distinct cultures, distinct ethnicities, and bring them together, because that's the substrate that you're consuming. Like Game A consumes indigenous humans. That's what it exists on. It uses indigenous humans to mediate its relationship to nature, which is to say, like you and me, we're indigenous humans first, right? You're born, you're an indigenous human, and then you become a member of Game A through the process of enculturation and education. And so then Game A deploys this in that fashion. Now, for some period of time, and fits in spurts, because Game A is an attractor. It's like a kind of thing that exists as a possibility. There might be points in history where Game A is discovered differentially. Like it's quite likely that say the Central Americans, the Mayans and the Olmecs and whatnot discovered Game A entirely independently from, say, the Sumerians. It's possible they didn't. They may have cross-communicated, but it's also possible they did. It's not, neither one's necessary as a hypothesis. But the basic idea is we build this toolkit, and the way we build this toolkit is we move from the embodied to the formal. All right, so we move from everybody is living mostly in a first-person perspective to everybody is now living in a third-person perspective. And examples of this would be things where religion moves from your direct embodied relationship to life to religion becomes a text, a document that is written, that has a priestly class that has the responsibility for controlling the formal structure of the text and communicating the content of that text to a group of people. Same thing with the king, right? Instead of governance being something that's living in the clan, in the group of people, with different roles to be sure, suddenly governance becomes a formal structure that literally lives at a level of abstraction. The idea, the formal structure of governance has an identity all itself. A very clean way of describing that is the leader because he is respected as the leader, or is he the leader because there's a chair called leader and he's sitting in it, right? That's the difference. And what Game A discovers is that as you move into these formal structures and you identify formal structures of governance, formal structures of economics around money, formal structures of ways of engaging in formalization of identity, where roles and responsibilities, like I am no longer a person, I'm no longer Victor, I am the Mason. Right? My role in the formal structure supersedes my identity, because it's very important that the machine of Game A operate functionally. And the fact that you may be loved by your family is not relevant to the state, for example. The state just needs you to, or the market and the state, which are two sides of the same coin, needs you to fit into the machine. And so that's Game A. And what happens is that once Game A becomes adequately stable, different variations on this theme emerge in different places, it begins to have this explosive effect. Because then what happens is I can create a warrior caste. I create a role and responsibility of warrior, which takes hunters and converts them into a specialized group supported by a high-scale machine. And I can go out and I can conquer my neighbors at scale, and I can integrate them into my empire. And now I can actually expand quite rapidly and control territory. So everything in my periphery, all the human indigenous groups in my periphery, become the territory that I absorb and integrate into my systemic machine. So that's Game A. Now, the problem with Game A is that it's structurally unstable. It will collapse. Any Game A structure will eventually collapse. There's a lot of argumentation on exactly why that is the case, but for the moment, I'll just assert it. For three basic reasons, by the way. It'll either collapse because of its relationship with the substrate, indigenous humans and nature, fails. So the Mayan civilization collapsing because of crop failure, for example. It can collapse because of it doesn't have, human formal systems don't have the ability to deal with the accumulation of entropy in the micro processes. A great example is like you go to what used to be a beautifully well-functioning train station or airport, and you notice that after 100 or 150 years, it gets increasingly gummed up. Like there's just gunk everywhere. Trash doesn't get cleaned up. Things get worn down, and our systems start to get that entropy built in, and they begin to break down. But the human indigenous structures are able to enter into the gaps, and what'll end up happening is there'll be corruption from the inside. And then the third is push pressure from the outside. So the collapse of the Roman Empire has these characteristics of all three. Right? There's the collapsing of the natural systems, lead poisoning, crop failures, things like that. There's the corruption of the interior and the kind of the hollowing out of the vitality of the imperial mode and the increasingly fractious power structures between emergent clan groups on the inside, and then eventually the pressure of the barbarian structures on the outside push through and fire off the collapse. And you can do this over and over again. Just pick the Chinese, one of the Chinese empires. You can pick the Bronze Age collapse. And you'll see that there's a bunch of basic dynamics that are conserved across all possible variations on game A. That's the key idea. Right? There's a principled argument. And that our current version, right, the peak predator of game A, which is the American empire coming out of World War II, is in the late stages of its collapse. And it's very likely that either our version or the machinic, the AI version that will come after that, is the last possible move in the game A metagame. Okay? So then the question is, well, what might be an alternative? Is there something we can do that's operating at the right level of analysis that is able to be in response to game A, not just another variation on game A, because we've already proposed that there may be not one or two more moves left in that whole game, but is qualitatively distinct, right? So then you say that first move, by hypothesis, we're just going to call that game B. So we're creating a design space of that which is not game A, and by the way, is also not indigenous mode, but is able to, or what are the characteristics of game B? And the characteristics start becoming the design constraints. So game B must be something that is not subject to the inevitable collapse characteristics of game A. So its internal design is not, Schmachtenberger would call it, inexorably self-terminating. Weinstein's would call it, it is an evolutionary stable strategy. There's more or less two ways of saying the same thing. It has to be strong enough that with a relatively small amount of attachment, humans attaching to game B, it can maintain itself in the context of an accelerating collapse. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then we can start populating more and more characteristics around it. It turns out to be able to get some of these primary characteristics correct, you have to be able to tap into, for example, a fundamental aspect of reality, which is what I think I call the anti-rivalrous, which I can expand upon if you'd like. But that basically gets us to game B. So you've got this sort of pyramidal structure of what are the core design constraints, what are the design characteristics that are necessary to achieve those design constraints, and to the degree to which those are geometric, meaning we could say these are for sure necessary, and then a whole bunch of heuristics that cascade around that, saying these are likely the appropriate sort of design spaces where solutions, and by the way, methodologies for searching solution space are going to live. That was an extremely theoretic and esoteric discussion. I hope that the people who are listening are prepared for that.
Si tu apprécies cette chaîne, pense à t'abonner et à activer la cloche. Et n'hésite pas à donner de la visibilité à cette vidéo en la likant, en la partageant ou en la commentant. La Fabrique Sociale est un média indépendant et a grand besoin de soutien financier. Si tu en as les moyens, n'hésite pas à faire un don sur ma page Tipeee. Même les petits gestes sont très importants pour la survie de cette chaîne.
Before we go deeper maybe on the game B characteristics, I'd like to talk about technology, because it's such an important piece of the conversation, and often people think about technology just as like a physical tool, sophisticated physical tool, but it might be much more broader than that. What's your definition of technology, and more importantly, I think, how does it relate to power?
Nice. All right. So remember winding back to this definition of game A that talked about this orientation towards formalism, or towards the formal. Technology is probably the mother of that move. Technology is what happens when mind is able to observe some sort of systemic dynamic and can foreground certain key principles, formal characteristics that are the essence of that system from the point of view of a given set of purposes. For example, I have a rock. I'm endeavoring to use that rock to scrape a hide clean. I notice as I pay attention to what I'm doing that if the rock has a certain set of design characteristics, in this case, what we would call sharpness, then it's more effective than if it's blunt. So it's noticing, what I'm noticing is I'm able to actually identify characteristics, which is to say I'm foregrounding phenomenological elements of the experience on the basis of purpose. And then I'm able to select on the basis of those characteristics. And then, so first order is I say, okay, I need sharp rock. I literally would probably coin the term sharp rock. Ah, sharp rock. Sharp rock works better. And then somebody else might actually look at that and say, is there a meta behavior where I can take rocks and I can try to make sharp? Because I've identified sharp as a formal concept. This is the whole point of how technology works. I can take embedded, embodied reality, and I can produce a conceptual model of that reality that are in the space, on the formal space. And then, of course, I can begin to orient towards what behaviors select for the formal characteristics that I prefer on the basis of my purposes, and maybe background characteristics that I don't prefer, possibly to my detriment. In other words, there's unintended consequences of my design criteria. And then I just start iterating. Right? And as I iterate, I notice that I can move from, say, in the case of sharp rock, merely sorting to actually then engaging in another behavior, which is now called sharpening. And now sharpening allows me to have a higher quality of rock. And so this is that's technology. Now notice in that technology, I have physical objects, so rock, but I also have behaviors like sharpening that I can work on. And both of these are techne, right? Technique and technology are all part of the same cluster. And they feed back on each other, right? As soon as you have an object, you're inevitably now participating in the technique of that object. Once you have a rock that can sharpen, you now are beginning to engage in the technique of sharpening to explore the possibility that the rock unlocks, which then has a whole bunch of adjacent behaviors that become available. And so there's a relationship between culture and technology that has a feedback loop. As technology moves, it puts pressure on certain characteristics of culture and unlocks novel possibilities. The culture begins to use a variety of different techniques to explore. And as it unlocks those techniques and ameliorates certain techniques, then it enables a next round of technological exploration. So that's what I mean.
Cool. And because we are digging some notions here, let's continue. One maybe crucial difference that seems to distinguish game A and game B lies in the distinction between complicated and complex systems. Maybe you could unpack these two notions and how they are related to our current situation.
Yeah, and I apologize. I left out power. So let me rewind, talk about power, and then come back to the complicated and the complex. Power is actually something kind of simple. What we can say is that power is the amount of change in the world in accordance with our purposes with a certain degree of energy. And so it's a very simple definition, but I think it covers a lot of territory that we may need to think. I put some, what are those called in the old style astronomy, micro definitions to capture more cases. Yeah, but essentially, if I have a hammer, my hammer now increases my muscular capacity to cause a nail to go into wood with less energy. So the same amount of energy can deploy more change in the direction of my purposes. Right? So will, change, energy, power. And as you can imagine, then technology is a power multiplier across both in terms of amount of energy and the kinds of change that could be deployed. So I can make changes that I couldn't have made before, and I can make more change with the same amount of energy, which then potentially unlocks entirely new purposes. So that you can see how those pieces fit together. Complicated and complex. My way of thinking about this now, by the way, you can imagine this has evolved tremendously since I was first introduced to the formulation by Dave Snowden golly, I don't even know how long ago, 20 years ago, something like that, 15, somewhere in that zone. So I'll give you the, actually, I'll give you the rote or the chapter and verse, and then I'll work backwards. His model, the Kahneman model, actually has 4: the simple, the complicated, the complex, and the chaotic. The boundary between, simple, complicated, complex, chaotic. So it's a 4 square. The boundary between the left and the right is, I think, epistemological. So the simple are all phenomena where the phase space, or the state of possible, the space of possible states of the object are well within a given agent's cognitive capacity. So tic-tac-toe. And when you're 4, you may not be able to model all possible moves in your head. By the time you're 8, you understand tic-tac-toe completely. Right? So it's now rendered into the simple. It is well within your cognitive capacity. The complicated is a finite state space, but one that is outside of the cognitive capacity of a given agent. So the classic example would be like the crew of a ship. You know, when you're running a ship, you're running something where you could produce, or the diagram of a Boeing 747. Right? In principle, I can print out a thick book that includes all of the elements of it and all of the different characteristics of what the design requirements are of that. And in principle, one person with an adequately large cognition could hold all of that, at which point it would be simple. But in practice, it requires a crew. It requires a group of people, and these days probably cybernetic group of people and machines, to contain the ability to interact with that state space properly. And I notice that there is already an ethical element, meaning we're talking about human or agentic relationships with their environment. This is not a ontological argument, it's an ethical framework. If it's simple, my ethical framework is I can completely decide how I'd like it to play out. If it's complicated, a group that is large enough and well integrated enough can then navigate it properly. Right? Then when we move over to the complex, domain, what we're dealing with is situations where the ability, I'll actually just say it formally, the state space is unbound. There is no finite state space. This is both because, well, for 3 principal reasons. 1, my interaction with the environment changes the environment. So I am actually producing novelty, which obviously means that there's no limit to its possible where it might go. The second is that the system is sensitive to micro level conditions. And so subtle changes in the environment, which may be, by the way, the entire universe, might change the context that I'm operating in. So it's not well bounded. It hasn't got a completely hermetic boundary to the external environment. And micro changes upregulate. And then the third is that the actual internal dynamics of the system are subject to evolutionary novelty. So it could just mutate spontaneously, right, without anything else. So one or all of those characteristics produce a complex system. And what happens, remember, this is an ethical environment or ethical framework. When I move into a complex system, my behavior has to change completely. I can no longer govern it. I can no longer produce a cybernetic schema that allows me to master it completely. Like when governing in the sense of like a steam engine. I can no longer produce a control structure that allows me to have precise actions that reliably produce precise results. By the way, a computer is a really good example of a complicated system. Yeah. And then, by the way, a chaotic system, we could ignore for the moment. Chaotic systems are ones where my ability to make forward predictions of the consequences of my actions drops effectively to 0. Complex systems are not chaotic. Complex systems are things where we can, in fact, make good choices. We can make effective choices in complex systems. We just make them in a completely different way than we would in complicated systems. Now, notice, reality or nature is complex. The only complicated and simple systems in the world are ones that are produced by humans. So what happens is that we take a complicated environment and then we boundary it. And inside that boundary, we are then able to produce something which we can manage and control for a while until the complex penetrates back in and fucks up all our plans. All right, so there you go. And by the way, you can imagine as you listen to that, you can see how that feeds back on the definition of game A and the failure conditions of game A quite nicely. Right? Game A is the, hey, let's build complicated systems game.
Great. Yeah, that makes me think about Alan Watts, who used to tell that the world is wiggly, or reality is wiggly, and that by trying to grasp it with words and numbers and concepts, we will only make it more messy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's closely linked. I'm curious about your advice on that, but I believe it's closely linked to the work of Ian McGilchrist, which relates to hemispheric difference in the brain. And in his framework, the left hemisphere of the brain is like power-seeking and has a tendency for abstraction. And he argues that the left hemisphere is also kind of the hemisphere of the written word and of money, which are symbols. And so the left hemisphere is kind of the map. The right hemisphere is deals more with reality, we could say. And so part of our problems will come from the fact that we operate mostly with the left hemispheric characteristics, and mistaking models of reality for reality.
Yes.
And that can make us think about of GDP, which is a
Sure.
very, very poor model that kind of became an end in itself. So I'm curious about your opinion on this.
Well, Ian's work was also another one of these epiphanies when we found it, and okay, this is really good, and it answers a lot of questions. So yes, absolutely, and I've now had an opportunity to spend time with Ian twice, and I think his contribution is critical. So yes, and by the way, you can see how nicely these things interleave, because say, okay, the left hemisphere is the managing complicated hemisphere. Neat. Now, what I want to do is then take this and notice there's a recursion, or what is this called? Like if you take dough, now I'm thinking of croissant. So I take dough and I fold it, and then I fold it and I fold it. I get something which has got all kinds of layer to it. So I notice that my left hemisphere, obviously I'm not noticing it in that way, but a certain way of relating to the world, back to our sharp rock, right? I can do a certain move and I can produce a better result. I can say, oh, okay, I can sharpen better, right? So then what happens is, as I move out of the indigenous mode into game A, right, I'm more and more and more leaning on that capacity, which is to say that I'm leaning on I make a house. So I'm no longer living outside, subject to weather. I'm able to create a complicated structure, a house that has walls and a roof, and I can actually build a blueprint and you design it. And this is nice in the sense that I can now cybernetically control my environment. I can actually make the temperature what I'd like it to be, or avoid, the rain or wolves or whatever it happens to be. I can exit myself from the complex into the complicated. It also has the interesting feedback that the left hemisphere is more naturally prepared to navigate the set of questions that emerge in a complicated environment. So I am now leaning more, I'm becoming more attached to and developing more the left hemisphere. I invent things like, say, accounting, or I invent writing, which allow me to navigate and build more complicated environments, which also lean more on the capacities of the left hemisphere, which means by definition that I'm also leaning less on the capacities of the right hemisphere. And I start getting this hypertrophication of the left and whatever the opposite is, an amelioration of the right. Yeah. Notice how this feeds. So I get more dependent on my complicated environment because I am simultaneously more powerful. My left hemisphere has this capacity to navigate this complicated environment very well in that environment, but I'm also more helpless outside of that complicated environment. I mean this literally neurocognitively. And so this produces a feedback loop, and we start getting, now, as our civilization becomes more complicated, I have to take humans and I have to squeeze them into a thing that can actually run this complicated environment. It's really hard. I have to produce literacy early, often, and regularly, because literacy now becomes a mechanism for being able to do the functions of operating in our complicated environment. How do I know what to do? I got to be able to read the sign. Like if I can't read the sign, I can't navigate the freeway. Like I'm hazardous. Okay, everybody's got to have that skill. And so what happens is you produce people who are more and more left brain dominant, who are more and more capable of outputting a more complicated environment, which has more capacity to control and manage more of complex reality, but which requires a higher degree of complicated capacity, which requires new institutions or new neurological changes to be able to do it. And this is one of the other elements that pushes you into the collapse mode. You get further and further away, more and more over your skis on complicatedness, internally, interrelationally, and systemically, and less actually able to use your whole mind. And this is where a lot of these failure conditions pop up.
Yeah, to bounce back on that, so I work with kids on about social media addiction, and so that makes me think of the architecture that we created and that contains now our social relationships, where kids are so used to have social relationships in the digital that they have a hard time now like just talking in reality. And that's kind of a phenomenon of reification, where you take the complexity of social interactions and you put them on social media, and now like social interactions are measured by like narrow metrics, likes, comments, and all that. So that's like a kind of a reduction of the complexity of I believe social relationships. And the other thing that I was like thinking about before the interview is that I guess, like, I just read a book about von Neumann, and I think he's really a good illustration of a way of thinking, because he's kind of like one of the first human computer, like thinking at very, very fast. And it seems like he wanted to grasp reality by using mathematics, and had the desire for control, certainty, and power. And in the work of McGilchrist, what he argues also is that the left hemisphere is really uncomfortable with uncertainty. So we have this example of von Neumann, who had such an impact on our society, and he has a great intelligence, but seems to lack some basic values. Like he was in the cold logic of game theory. He was like prepared to order a first nuclear strike on the USSR. He's actually, when he was dying, apparently his family was pretty shocked, because he was so afraid of death, like a little child, and they couldn't make sense of it, because it was like, okay, so you were like prepared to order a first nuclear strike on a country with millions of casualties, and and you didn't have like the basic value to you were afraid of your own death. And so I wonder how this kind of thinking is penetrating in our society today.
Oh, wildly. So let me see if I can. So addiction, you said addiction to social media, and this sort of recursive effect that I was describing earlier is best understood as a kind of addiction. So von Neumann, right, when you become addicted to the cybernetic control, right, addicted to the capacity to build complicated systems that you can use to govern the complex environment with low uncertainty, you then become dependent upon that capacity. And the only way to respond when complexity inevitably erupts back into your complicated environment is to make it more complicated. Right, so this puts you into a complicated dependency spiral. By the way, you can see this all over the place. Even like just a really good case study is just look what happens to companies, like human formal systems that live inside the larger system of the market. They go through these complicated spirals. The other side that I was trying to get a sense of is, it seems to me obviously symmetric that it's exactly the kind of underdeveloped, let's say, right hemisphere underdeveloped whole, actually a better way of putting it, precisely the same kind of underdeveloped wholeness of self that is capable of using game theory to decide the fates of millions, and is unable to come to rich terms with your own mortality. These, as far as I can tell and concerned, these are basically the same thing. These are mirror images of the same underdeveloped wholeness. So I always see Nietzsche's reverse monstrosities when I have this image, right? These things that are all head and no body, or C.S. Lewis's Men Without Chests. Like we produce people who are hypertrophied in a very narrow capacity, but at the cost of being woefully underdeveloped in all other capacities, and then to try to imagine that we can scaffold them with a variety of different kinds of technologies to make up for that problem. Yeah. And I guess, and of course, so what happens is you say, well, this addiction problem, which leads to the complex erupts into our complicated systems. And if I'm addicted, the only way I can deal with it is I have to make an even more complicated response. Yeah. If you could just keep doing that forever, you might. Hey, we'll just make it more complicated, more complicated, more complicated, more complicated, more complicated. But the argument, the proposition is that you can't, that there is in fact a limit, a hard limit to the capacity to produce and manage complicated systems. And that therefore wisdom would counsel to not go down that path, right? Wisdom would say, hey, once you've entered into an addiction to the complicated, that's exactly the time to have your moment of clarity and resettle back into complex reality, which can use complicated systems, but it's not addicted to them, right? See the difference, there's the difference there. And I would say COVID, for example, is a really, really good case study of what it looks like when a culture has become so addicted to complicatedness that when the complex erupts into that culture, the only way it can respond is to try to play the game of whack-a-mole with more and more complicatedness and have all the negative consequences of that feed back on the system, creating a series of systemic cascades of more and more problem.
Yeah. So we talked about addiction, and it seems like addiction is also related to game theory, because we see arms races to addiction in the market pretty much everywhere. Let me maybe quote an extract from the latest paper of the Conscience Project. It says, "Science can tell us about what is in the world, but it cannot tell us about what ought to be. And in the absence of guiding values to help us determine the goodness of a particular outcome, decisions tend to be made in a manner that prioritizes winning. In other words, operating with the world on the basis of what is, but not what ought to be, tends to result in choices being determined by the logic of game theory, what it takes to win in a narrow sense, regardless of the cost."
Yeah.
I'm wondering what's your take on that, and what is the role of game theory in our current predicament?
Well, there's a larger category here, and I'll include things like, say, utilitarianism, of which game theory is not a subset, but they're very closely related, and they're all part of the same basic structure, which is an effort to launder the qualitative into the quantitative. Right? That's what this category is. Right? It's an effort to try to deal with the ought by means of something that can be measured in terms of what is. Right? So if I could say, hey, I mean, we can use money. Money is very confusing because it produces the result if it converts oughts to ises. It says, hey, what is the value of this? $50. It converts an arbitrarily large number of qualities, diverse values across potentially whole populations, and collapses it into a perfectly analytical metric, $50, a simple analytical metric, $50. And so money shows the power of the ability to do that. We can do that. The problem is that also shows the weakness of that. All of the values that were qualitative that are not included in that narrow collapse are in fact lost when you're operating. This is why the GDP metric is a problem. GDP has the advantage that it is a metric. It has the advantage that it's quantitative. It has the advantage that it can be measured and it can be managed, and it can be we can use it to produce cybernetic control systems around the the vast economy. It has the remarkable disadvantage that it includes nothing of relevance. Right? It includes all of the values that we actually care about, that actually are the things on the basis of which we actually make live choices, are thrown out entirely. And then the result, the hope, the intent is that we can, as long as we get this number big, this stuff will come with it automatically. But the problem is that, in fact, that's not the case. And so studying what happens with utilitarianism and or what's the most recent version of this? Effective altruism, right? Discovering and looking at the degenerate collapse that is intrinsically built into the intent or the effort to launder the qualitative into the quantitative, which then, of course, also launder the right brain to the left brain, and the complex into the complicated. All these are sort of variations of the same thing. You can see that collapse, right? You can see monstrosities begin to emerge. Von Neumann, right? You can see monstrosities begin to emerge that any reasonable person would look at that and go, "Are you crazy? Like, that's literally obviously monstrous." And the poor monster on the other side, who has no capacity to even perceive reality clearly anymore because they're laundering everything through these schemas of cybernetic control structures, is looking at you going, "Well, what do you mean? Like, the number went up. I don't understand what the problem is." It's funny. That same community in a previous generation, when thinking about AI, came up with this metaphor of the paperclip maximizer. Well, everything on that side of the line is a paperclip maximizer. So it's not like we'll one day run into one. We've been living in one for 10,000 years.
Yeah. I'd like us to go towards an analysis of how information drives societies. And I believe you thought very deeply about that. What can we learn of the ancient information technologies, such as orality, the written word, even television, because it's kind of ancient now, to understand our current society?
Well, and the way that you framed it, the first thing that pops forward is to think about the form or the medium, right? The medium is the message. That's a very, very, very good phrase, which is funny because he never said it. But in any event, the medium is the message. And so to the dull left brain, let's just make a simple example of, like, I was bit by the dog, received orally, like right now, I was bit by the dog. Received textually, write it down, I was bit by the dog. Received fantastically, TV show, somebody, I was bit by the dog, right? In one sense, those are the same sentence. But if you actually get yourself involved in the existential, the psychological, and the phenomenological, they're radically different. And a big part of this is actually the notion of context or contextualization and decontextualization. Oh my gosh, there's so much here. Just a little branch. We have to remember that the human mind is very fluid. And the human mind does not come preloaded with the ability to distinguish between what is healthy behavior and what is unhealthy behavior past certain narrow limits. It's just doing its best, and it's doing its best on the basis of narrow feedback loops that are built into human hardware. Like, if you touch something that burns, that's probably not good, although that can be changed. And then horizontal, cultural, watching other people and having them give feedback. So we get poured into the environment that we're in. This is the point I'm trying to make. Our mind is shaped by the context that our mind finds itself in. And so a TV mind is different than a literacy mind. And that difference makes a lot of difference. Like, it literally is struggling with different ways of being successful and different challenges. Or as your kids, right? The social media mind is a different kind of mind than the TV mind, right? My mind is a TV mind. I happen to get on computers very, very early for my generation. So I live in this weird hybrid zone where I have a digital mind as well. But the Zoomers have digital minds, and they're just different, completely different in the sense of how do I say it right? How they relate to reality. I mean, that's the right way of putting it. Literally, how they perceive reality and how they perceive what possible actions can be taken in relationship to reality. And so, for example, when they encounter a human being in physical space, they're a little bit, whoa, that's not, what is that? Like, it's novel, and I don't have a portfolio of proper ways to respond, and it's really a lot, like huge amount of complexity compared to this narrow band that I've become optimized for. And so it's like an ice skater suddenly having to walk on dry land or something like that. Like, ice skating prepares you for a very set of narrow functions for moving on a particular surface. You move onto dry land, you got a whole other set of possibilities you got to deal with. Okay, so information, right? The word form is there. Right? So information is the process whereby we convert complex phenomenology into some kind of form, right? We make it formal, right? We form it, and then we're able to use that to convey it to some other mind, which is then able to unpack it in some fashion. But that unpacking is not neutral. Right? The form carries a lot. In fact, in some sense, the form carries more than the content, because you're receiving the form of a given moment. Right? If you're in the era of TV, you're receiving TV. The signal of TV is always present. The shows change, right? And the content of the shows changes, but your mind is getting the form constantly. And so the shape of your mind is converting itself into the form of the medium with which it is predominantly interacting. Now, if you're in TV, you're also an analog. And if you're an analog, you spend a lot of time in physical reality and in orality. And you're also reading books, right? So you've got these multiple different environments, but TV is big. As we've moved forward in time, more and more minds have spent more and more time in the digital and less time in any other place, which is quite unique, right? Because we have this capacity to be wildly isolated in physical space. We're not interacting with trees. We're not interacting with dogs. We're not interacting with tigers. We're not interacting with other physical humans. We're not interacting with books. We're just interacting with digital. And so it's a novel. Like this, what I said in terms of medium is the message is generically true across all cultural forms. The digital is unique in many, many important ways, which I, by the way, if you'd like to, we can go off on that. That's a very, very big tangent, but the digital is unique in a lot of very important ways. But this notion of the form of the medium is the primary signal and conveys so much. So I'll give you like a concrete example. It's a different thing. The form of the class, like the classroom. The form of the classroom, regardless of what class it is, it has a standard geometry. Standard geometry says that there's a teacher, usually one, maybe two, and there's a class. The class might be two people, it might be hundreds, right? But the key thing is there's an asymmetry of relationship. There's a small number and a large number, and there's a very particular direction of how a protocol, how information flows. Information flows from the teacher to the class. The teacher's job is to convey information. The class's job is to absorb information. The teacher's job is to verify the information has been absorbed properly. The class's job is to verify the information is absorbed properly by complying with the teacher's protocol. And that's the form of the class. And that conveys a tremendous amount of content that is independent of the particular content that is being taught. Whether it's a history class or a cooking class or a physics class, the form of class is conveying something fundamental about who's who, what's what, how do things work properly, et cetera, which then, by the way, shapes the mind of the individual participating in it until their mind is designed to assume these structures are natural and are, in fact, to build a portfolio of behaviors that are able to navigate that environment well, which works fine. Kind of. I mean, it actually never works fine, but it works fine kind of, as long as the complicated system that you're embedded in itself is actually adaptive in the realm of reality. But when you reach the point where an entire structure of classroom produces humans that can't actually navigate the actual reality that they're in, then the entire form is the problem.
Yeah. Makes me think in our last interview, Zach Stein talked about the difference between context-based education and content-based education.
Nice.
What he was saying was like we don't talk about education often actually in the media landscape in France. We don't talk it very much, but when we talk about it, we talk about the content, but we don't question the context. And here Ivan Illich also in his book Unschooling was asking the question, where do we learn? And the most important things that you learned where did it take place? It was like saying, well, by interacting with the world, with reality, and not so much in the school.
Yeah, yeah, and you can look at other structures. Like we can think about the bureaucratic mind, also the military mind, or the medical mind, right? Because these are minds that have been poured into an institutional form, a context where there's lots of things that are going on, but the context is constant. And so they begin to simply adopt the shape of that context as their natural, literally their identity, which then of course means if they run into problems that cannot be well responded to with that form of mind, they have real trouble.
One interesting aspect of information that we could talk about is the difference between centralization and decentralization. And there was, I wonder about how the shift between television and the digital landscape and social media affected how we govern and how institutions function, and how trust is how trust is evolving in our open societies. So
there's do you know this move in volleyball where the guy does he does this called a set?
Not really.
No. Okay, well that's a set. It should be a set. I don't know if you know this, but I am uniquely positioned to answer this question, so I better do a good job, which I might not. We'll see, because my companies, I was a tech entrepreneur before I was a dad, I suppose. And the thing that we tried to do was decentralize the media landscape, which we succeeded at, right? So this conversation we're having is happening as a consequence of my company's building video into the internet. YouTube is a consequence of that, right? So this decentralization of the media was literally the strategic intent. We did it on purpose. So let's talk about broadcast. So when we say centralization in the context of media, broadcast is the topology. So broadcast looks like what we were talking about earlier with the classroom. There is a very small number of broadcasters. Let's just use, let's run the clock back, I don't know, the 70s, the 80s, something like that. There's, in the United States, 3, ultimately then 4 people who were speaking the evening news to literally everybody else, right? So 300 million people who are audience, receiving, and 4 people who are speaking. That's broadcast, right? Now, what broadcast does at its best, the best version of broadcast, it relies on what's called a meritocracy, or credentialized meritocracy. It produces some kind of information processing system that is hierarchical in nature, that grabs New York Times. It grabs information from reality. There's some number of reporters who are out there gathering information. It does a bunch of information processing to simultaneously verify it, this is true, and value it, this is important. This is true and important. And then it moves it up the hierarchy until finally, because it has to do that, it has to take the very large amount of information in reality and convert it into the very small amount of information that can actually be broadcast. And there's only an hour. That's not very much bandwidth. So what gets selected to be broadcast has to be a tiny compression on what is in fact actually present in the information field. And everybody has to get it, right? And so at its best, this can do some good things. Like, let's say the landing on the moon. Right? You can broadcast the single signal of what is a very significant human event to everybody. And okay, that's neat. That's a thing that can be done. But it puts a huge amount of burden on that structure. And of course, anybody with any amount of strategic agency recognizes that capturing that structure is the crown jewels, and so it gets captured very quickly, inevitably, and regardless of the topology. Whether there's 1 channel or 3 channels or 5 channels, they will be captured. And therefore, then what happens is you get this weird bubble where people are no longer getting access to information. They're getting access to propaganda, which you may have talked to Zach as well, right? He studied that quite deeply. And that's that. That's what happens. So when you move to decentralization, you actually get a couple of different things that happen simultaneously. The hierarchy is no longer pyramidal. naturally. It can actually produce pyramids, but it does it polymorphically. Right? So the structure ends up being much more polymorphic. If information needs to be shared between just 3 people, those 3 people can self-assemble into a node and share that information. Right? So I can create a signal group and I can talk, what do they call them? Chat rooms. Is that right? Group chats. I create a group chat. That's a self-organizing structure. It doesn't have that same broadcast modality because the number of group chats that's available is the Reed's law number of human beings that are connected to the network, which is a very large number. The problem in a decentralized environment is a very different kind of problem. Now, the problem is no longer who's in control of the center and how do we make sure that the center is doing a good job of verifying and valuing. The problem is, who should I talk to about what? I could in principle talk to anybody, and I could in principle talk about anything, but now I have this combinatorial problem, meta problem of how do I get the information about who's relevant to me? And by the way, who am I relevant to? How do I make these encounters, to use Spinoza? How to make the conductus of our encounters maximally joyful? The best possible conversations are happening. And it might be you and me, or it might be 6 people. It's rarely going to be hundreds, by the way. It turns out that the proper structure in decentralized groups is actually around 12. And if groups get bigger, you generally will want to break them up and then reassemble them. So you get these Lego piece assemblages that form and unform and move around. It's very, very fluid. And the weirdest thing from my point of view is literally 25 years ago, even more than that, 27 years ago, a group of people, mostly, well, no, mostly academics, but not necessarily, looked at the digital world, the emerging digital world, and said, yep, that's what it's going to look like. It's kind of going to have these characteristics. And they were kind of right. I mean, the way it's played out has not been far outside of those theories, but we haven't got very good at it. It's shocking to me how shitty we are at it. It's remarkable to me. You look at, say, Twitter. You know, Elon buys Twitter, and what's the phrase? A wizard should know better. You know that phrase from Lord of the Rings? A wizard should know better. Like, it's really not that hard to make Twitter 10 times better at being a venue for speech, right? A venue for decentralized communication. But a combination of factors. One is, at the end of the day, Elon has a very narrow view of reality because he's an individual human, and because wealth and power create hierarchies naturally. But then 2, culturally, we just haven't actually taken full responsibility for these things that we're dealing with. But you can see like the difference, right, between the natural characteristics. And the key thing is that these characteristics are natural, that a decentralized system has a bunch of questions that it needs to ask, and a bunch of questions that are critical for of a broadcast system that it doesn't need to ask. Let me add one more piece on top. Generally speaking, when you move from one technical regime to another technical regime, you will have this importing of the technique, the aesthetics, and the sensibilities of the old regime into the new regime. You know, so when the early internet formed, the way that we thought about how did you create a list of things was like the Yellow Pages. The way that we thought about how you convey information was like a newspaper. So you just kind of took the organizational technique, right? Information organizations in the early internet modeled themselves on newsrooms, and the form, right? You made a page that looked like a newspaper and just, oh, I guess that's how it looks. So you just make a digital newspaper. But then, by necessity, by competitive pressures, to unlock the potential of the new form requires the innovation of entirely new sensibilities, aesthetics, methodologies. So in the category of information organization, for example, Google innovates PageRank. Right? PageRank as an algorithm is entirely impossible in an analog environment, is made possible in an appropriately networked and with formal memory digital environment, and radically changes your ability to find relevant information. And so a lot of the problem that we've been dealing with for the past 25 years has been that we have continued to rest upon sensibilities, techniques, intuitions that are actually still inherited and derived from the analog history, which makes sense because we've been living in the analog history since the beginning of the universe. We've only been living in digital for 25 years. It's a big difference. But very little of that is actually proper for the digital environment. So I used to call this pure digital. learning how to design in a pure digital fashion is a particular kind of skill.
Yeah, and so how would you make Twitter like 10 times better?
Well, I would actually make roughly, I think, 3 steps. So the first step is I would remove it from the necessity of being a profit-seeking market function to being a piece of the commons, right? So people talk about it sort of the digital town square. Town square does not have an economic P&L. And there's a reason for that. Like, it's critical, because what happens is that if the P&L, if you have a core P&L, then those are going to be your core values. And your algorithm is going to have to support those core values, and every other value becomes at best secondary, which ultimately means actually not at all. And so the first is you have to find a way to move it into a different mode of being of the commons. And only recently have we begun to be able to figure out how to do that properly. It's not a nonprofit, right? It's not a government function. These are all false dichotomies based upon a previous era's effort to solve the problem of the evaporation of the commons. Let me just back up. 500 years ago, we used to have states, markets, and commons. Now we have states and markets. With the evaporation and elimination of the commons, we're constantly trying to figure out how to solve problems using some combination of state and market. And most important problems can't be solved in that fashion. Okay. So Twitter needs to be moved into the commons. Probably, unless we just completely destroy it, something in the category of what is sometimes known as Bitcoin or crypto or blockchain is probably what that properly looks like. Then, of course, then the mandate of those who are working on the user interface, which includes the algorithm critically, is, and it's funny because they explicitly say this is important, but it's conatos. Oddly enough, I used the phrase earlier. You say, okay, the new algorithm is, how do you maximize the degree to which a given encounter between a person and the conversations they're having is maximally joyful? And I literally mean this in a Spinoza sense, right? So you'd have to double click on that to get a sense of what I mean, but that's well enough defined. And by the way, there's a lot, just a tremendous amount of difference between those two worlds. Just the separation between a world where the mandate that is put upon the category of the algorithm, which, by the way, smart systems architects might look at that and say, as it turns out, this probably needs to be a meta algorithm which produces a wide variety of differential algorithms, which are themselves state sensitive, so that when you, like in the morning, you're actually using one algorithm, or maybe we actually use AI to build a particular algorithm for you specifically that tracks you and is working with you as an individual. We don't have one master. I mean, once you change the mandate, there's a whole different systems architecture to figure out how to actually do this thing properly. And then the third, which is quite interesting, is then you would have to begin the process of creating the meta structure, which is, how do you train people to actually participate properly in this new milieu? Because people have been trained to become, I guess you'd call them what, repost grifters or something like that. Like that. What is a peak predator? What is a successful adaptive strategy in Twitter as it currently exists? Well, if you change the niche and say, hey, the new world looks like something completely different. It's funny. Like the metaphor would be something like, we used to be at war, so the right way of responding to somebody else was to shoot them as rapidly as possible. We're now at peace. So shooting them as rapidly as possible is no longer the right kind of behavior, but it may take some work to figure out what the right kind of behavior looks like. That's probably the way, literally a very good example. Like, we used to be at war. We've now changed the algorithm so we're at peace. What does collaboration look like? And how do we actually begin to think about new norms? And maybe, by the way, new human institutional structures that are entirely outside of the algorithm, because the algorithm is not everything, it's just a piece of it, that start saying things like, hey, guess what? Intentionally lying to people is really not legit anymore. Like, if you're discovered to be an intentional liar, this will have consequences that will reduce your ability to participate in what's happening, you know, which is what a healthy society looks like. And so that would be the third, right? So you'd have those three pieces, and those three pieces, did I say 10x? Or maybe more like 1,000x. Like, that's the amount of potential leverage there is off the charts, actually. And then, by the way, what I would do is I would layer an economy into it, since you're building on blockchain anyway. if you layer an economy into it, then people cannot just communicate, they can actually begin to collaborate, right? They can actually spontaneously organize structures of capacity. Micro collective intelligence is maybe a way of describing it, or I could use the term DAOs, but that probably is more confusing than helpful these days, around ideas, around vision, sensibilities, values, value clusters, and then they can resource that, and those resources can actually develop productive reality, which can be recursively returned back to the commons. Right? Hey, we think these things are good ideas we'd like to do. Oh, we have resources to apply to it. Those resources can now be accumulated onto it. And now it got better. Oh, neat. Now we've got this positive feedback loop that we're doing the thing we're doing better and better and better. And this, by the way, is something like this notion of pure digital. It's like, hey, let's just detach this digital structure from the inertia of the world from which we've come. Right? Twitter was born in the market, but that's because the commons didn't exist at all. Right? It's been almost completely obliterated. And thankfully, it wasn't born by the state, because then it would have sucked. And then it would have been replaced by something in the market. But that's a false dichotomy. Right? So let's move into this new world. What does pure digital look like, and how do we build these things properly?
Yeah. And I believe another important piece to mention or talk about is digital identity, because we are entering into the world of generative AI, and so trust on the internet is more and more fragile. So maybe you could unpack what is digital identity, and how do you see it fit in our current situation?
Yeah, this is very timely, because you say, as AI is accelerating, it's fun. I was just talking to some people about the fact that it seems like now my day job is just reporting thought bots on Twitter, you know, 4 or 5 a day minimum. And those are just the ones that are obvious. Like, I have no idea how many accounts that I'm interacting with are in fact AI. Okay, so let's problem. Unless you can have certainty that a digital agent that you're interacting with is a human, as we move past thresholds that we're blowing by, we're moving past these thresholds rapidly now, you will be encountering something, an AI, that is vastly more capable than you are. This is the key piece. If I'm encountering just like a stupid bot, that's annoying, right? But when I'm encountering an AI that is a whole lot more capable of engaging in manipulative behavior than I am capable in defending myself against manipulative behavior, which is a rising tide, right? At a certain point in time, it captures 20% of the population, you know, IQ 90 and below, whatever, right? At a certain point in time, it captures people IQ 110 and below. At a certain point in time, no human being is going to be able to penetrate the thicket of these wildly sophisticated AIs. And we should include, by the way, these AIs are not just semantically sophisticated, right? They not just have the ability to communicate very, very effectively. They're also data sophisticated, right? They have access to every single piece of data in your digital stream that's ever been produced, right? They know what shoes you like, right? They know what sports teams you attend to with more frequency, right? They know what particular kinds of offers in 15,000 distinct locations increase your attention rate by epsilon 0, right? Their ability to access data is, well, I don't even know, quadrillions of times higher than a ordinary human's ability to access data. And they can process that data in real time and use it to do things to you. All right, so that's the threat vector. That's the thing that's coming, and it's coming fast. Okay. Now, identity historically has actually been spread across a variety of different locations. There's roughly 2 kinds. One is relational identity. These are the identities that are developed in relationship, right? So you are beginning to form a relational identity of me, and I'm beginning to form a relational identity of you. This is in some sense, my mental model of who you are, which includes all various encounters we've had, all the richness of those encounters, and then any ancillary information like who you know, where I've seen you show up in different environments. So it's a relational identity. That's the baseline. Layered on top of that, we have bureaucratic identity. Right? Bureaucratic identity is like your driver's license, your passport, your medical card. These are usually narrow purpose-based. So the driver's license identity It starts out as literally a driver's license, your permission to drive a car. Now, these identities can then be repurposed. So this is the third layer. The third layer is if you want to get on an airplane, you have to show your driver's license. There's a purpose for that, and they're just repurposing existing identity structures. In an information environment, there is a how do you say it, a centrifugal force that identities will tend to want to collapse to the simplest possible structure because they're the highest utility if they can do that. So how this showed up in the internet was a single sign-on, if you remember that era. Facebook kicked that off. And only a handful of guys were able to actually establish power. So you had, hey, it's Facebook, it's Google, it's Twitter. Anybody else? That's about it. There may be one or two more. Obviously not highly relevant. So this was a rush. Maybe Microsoft probably has one that nobody likes or cares about. A rush to claim that space because identity is so fundamental in the stack. It's like it's very, very close to the very bottom of the most strategically leverageable piece of power. Because if I am attached to a given identity, then that means there's any service that isn't attached to the identity, it creates a barrier for entry for me to get into that service, a potentially very significant barrier to entry, the more rich that identity is. Right? If my identity contains all of my information and service wants to, like, an Amazon wants to be able to sell me stuff and it can't access the information about me that it allows its algorithm to make relevant offers, then that's a huge gap. So if I have two competitive services and one can access my rich identity, the other one can't, the one that can succeeds. And that, of course, creates an ecosystem of centrifugal force. And so, Apple, they're the other key identity structure. Okay, so now so what happens then is in the race to deal with the actual real looming threat of AI, the identity sweepstakes has kicked off. So in the past, the bureaucratic institutions were largely limited both because of their being bureaucracies and because of the legitimacy of identity was tied to narrow purposes, to being a grab bag of a variety of different identities and using them relatively narrowly. So you had whatever, 10. You had your credit card, you had your social security card, you had that's in the States, of course. You have a driver's license, a passport, insurance card, right? A proliferation, and they didn't really collapse on each other. And then the digital guys, right, the emerging Napoleons of digital, who would really, really like to own everybody all the way, because that's the most power and value you get, or value extraction you get if you can do that. They were blocked by the fact that there was only a relatively limited amount of your identity needs were digital. Right? I don't drive my car online; I drive my car in the physical world, and because they were competing with each other in a larger regulated environment. And there was very little that would cause humans to really be willing to jump into a single identity. But in the context of the AI threat, none of the existing identity structures are strong enough. None of the analog identity structures are even relevant. And none of the digital identity structures, A, were properly designed to deal with any of this, and then B, are the kinds of things that you would actually want to drop into that level of intimacy and care. Like, I don't want to give Microsoft my identity. That's insanity. Or Google, fuck those guys. Or Twitter, right? And there's literally, Apple, come on. It's insanity. So we're faced with a real problem. Either one of three things are going to happen. Either governments are going to innovate a new kind of meta bureaucracy, which spans all of their bureaucratic structures and creates a single unified identity. And that's going to be your identity, which has pluses and minuses to it for sure. Or one of the digital overlords, that's not the right term, digital principalities, will be able to build something strong enough that people flood into it. I'm actually kind of shocked that Elon didn't do that with Twitter. It would have been, instead of making the blue check a revenue structure, he should have just given that away. Because then he'd have like 300 million people in his identity structure, and then he could add more to the identity structure. Strategically seems foolish, but hallelujah. Or finally, again, identity lives in the commons, which is where it needs to live. Right? The proper place for identity is in the commons. And we need to build the right kind of infrastructure to allow that to happen. And once you've done that, then you can drop your identity there, and then all of the services sit on top of that. And again, the point is the clock is ticking. We are now in a time frame where any minute now, like it could be tomorrow, and it almost certainly happens in the next 2 or 3 years, that the AIs become so sophisticated that unless you have the ability to have certainty of two things. Somebody you're dealing with is not an AI, and the other vector is that the information you're dealing with is real, right? Those are the two. I'm interacting with, like, you could be, as far as I know, by the way, you could be an AI. I have no actual way to verify that you're not completely simulated. I could kind of assume that you're not, because I kind of still live in that world and I have those intuitions, but to my detriment a year from now, or to my detriment, who knows? So that's that.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have 10 minutes left. So I'd like to go to another subject, but that concerns you personally, because you became a Christian recently. I'm wondering what were the drivers of this, and what is, in your opinion, the role of religion in this shifting, fragile society that we found ourselves in?
Yeah, 10 minutes. We'll see if we can get that done.
Yeah.
Let me start with the second part first. As it turns out, this is a key thing. So on this journey, where this is a very, very deep dive of trying to understand a lot of things, the nature of civilization, the nature of psychology, ultimately grounding that in the nature of reality, lots of stuff. As it turns out, the thing that is often identified with religion, and I want to say it that way because it's sometimes identified with art, for example. So as far as I'm concerned, art and religion belong in the same category. And there's probably 6 or 7 other things that belong in that same category to some extent. But the thing that is often identified with religion is at the very bottom of the human cultural generator. So all cultures ultimately are produced by the thing that we would call religion, which again is also the thing that we would call art. The fact that those are separate is already an example of how broken we are. So maybe that's just assertion. Right? I was at this conference in London called ARC, which is very abrupt. Like, they don't really know exactly what's going on. But if you're trying to deal with the problem of the end of civilization, which is correct, that's where we are, and you're trying to do something like either regenerate or restore or recreate or have rebirth, as it turns out, the only way to do that is to be found in the thing that is often called religion. Now, I'm saying that in such a tortured way, largely to point out that the thing that is called religion is wildly institutionalized in the complicated game A sense. Right? So there's something that's contained within that thing that needs to be rediscovered, and we need to reconnect with that. And then that is the context from which all other possibilities emerge. And as an example, I talked about this notion of pure digital. And when you migrate from one context to another context, you migrate from analog newspapers to digital. The first step is you emulate. You copy existing forms. Well, where do you innovate new forms? Where do new forms come from? New forms come from that place that is sometimes called religion, sometimes called art, right? Sometimes what people might call the transcendent or the sacred, or a variety of different terms. I often would also call it the commons. These are the same place. And these are all the same place. And we have to get to that place. And that place is the place from which all possible cultural regeneration emerges. And anything that doesn't get there is guaranteed to fail in any effort to restore, regenerate, rejuvenate, even redesign. So that's that. Like, I get to that point already a couple of years ago. Now, what we thought we might do, because we were very arrogant, is that right? I won't be mean. Let's say I was arrogant. What we thought we meant to, and I participated in that because I was arrogant, was create this thing we were calling a religion that's not a religion. Say, hey, there's a bunch of error conditions that seem to have shown up in the variety of religions that we have received. So we need to do something which is from this place, this category of the sacred, but isn't participating in the error conditions of the existing religions. Yeah, it's not a terrible thing to hope for. The problem with that is we're not that smart. The problem with that is that the combined work of billions of people over millennia, many of whom have committed a level of personal sacrifice and devotion to the thing they're working on, which is orders of magnitude greater than anything I could aspire to. We're not going to reinvent that in a decade, 2 decades, 5 decades, right? With 12 people, 100 people, 1,000 people. There's just it's not going to work. And now we have to move back one last piece, right? The final sort of ligature to put on the top. Let me see if I can say this right. Back to the question of the nature of reality. Have you heard of this concept of re-enchantment?
Probably,
Yeah.
but tell me.
So let me see. Hold on. So in just the same way that if you move from war to peace, you need to reform your mind. It's a very different kind of mind to respond to that. To move from game A to game B, you also have to reform the kind of who you are. You have to become capable of being in relationship with reality. And reality is not that which we were conveyed in the context of game A. In the context of game A, we're in relationship always with the complicated. Occasionally with nature, but even in the context of nature, rarely with nature, for real. But reality is the thing we have to be able to be in relationship with. It turns out reality is enchanted. It turns out the received version of reality of our complicated systems for the last 500 or so years is just, in fact, wrong. I'll just put it simply. And if you're trying to do something on the basis of wrong, particularly a wrong model of reality, you shouldn't be surprised that things don't work out well. Well, as it turns out, every religion ever has a different sense of reality than the kind of post-Enlightenment modernity Western version. And that once you open yourself up to that larger view of reality, you begin to be able to engage with that reality more fully. And those religions are, in fact, they're correct. Their model of reality is closer to reality than the one that we're actually just exiting from in the post-Enlightenment Western secular world. So upon discovering this, right, step by step, opening myself up to that and delving into a very wide variety of different religious traditions across a diversity of different types, I learned more about reality in an embodied fashion, and noticed that there's a lot of stuff that you have to start taking into account when you're entering into relationship with reality. For example, what spirits are you worshiping? That's a very important question. It turns out to be a critical question. And if you're naive to that question, you will definitely be worshiping the wrong ones. Because they're very good at attracting the naive, like money, for example. The spirit of Mammon is very, very good at getting people to worship him, because if you don't know what's going on, he's a pretty easy thing to worship. And there's lots of more, right? You can worship power, martial strength, and you can worship a variety of spirits. And spirit is the proper way of describing it, by the way. So if you think very, very carefully about the sets of questions that open up when you're engaging with reality, and you think about the questions like which spirit should you be in relationship with at all, and in particular, which one should you trust deeply, you'll end up with Christ. So that's a very simple way of putting it, and obviously there's a lot on it, but that is a proposition I will make. It is the end state of earnestly seeking reality and truth.
Well, Jordan, thank you so much for your time.
It was a pleasure. I have not had an opportunity. I find it very interesting. So I've had this kind of conversation with a Russian individual,
Okay.
A brilliant individual. And now I've had this conversation with you, who was representing the spirit of France. And yeah, I don't have these conversations with English, British, or American, or anybody else from the colonies anymore, which I'm curious. I'm not sure exactly what's happening, but thank you. It's been a long time since I've had an opportunity to have sort of this set of thoughts out there.